The peaches finished ripening on the windowsill 3 days after the whole thing was over, and I ate one standing at the sink at 6 in the morning, juice running down my wrist, in no hurry at all. That was the strange part, the not being in a hurry. For 11 months, I had been the kind of tired that sleep does not touch. And then one Sunday, I woke up before my alarm and lay there listening to the mockingbird that lives in the crepe myrtle behind my rent house in Fredericksburg, and I understood that the machine had finally come to rest. Kelly had signed the papers her lawyer told her to sign. My name was on the deed again, only my name. And the house on Sabinal Street where I grew up was not going to be sold out from under me by anyone. I keep going back, though, to one image from the worst night of it. The way you keep touching a chipped tooth with your tongue. My half-sister Kelly standing in my mother's old kitchen, holding a manila folder against her chest like a schoolgirl who has not done the reading, telling me it was already done, that the money had already moved. And behind her, half in shadow by the pantry door, her husband Dell watching me with the patient look of a man waiting for a machine to accept his dollar. To understand that peach, and why I could stand there so calm with the juice on my wrist, you have to know what happened last spring, and you have to start with the folder, and you have to let me tell it in order, because if I jump ahead, none of it will land the way it landed on me. I am Opal York, and I turned 36 the March all of this began. I run a Mazak turning center on the day shift at a shop called Kerrville Precision out on Highway 27, where we make hydraulic fittings and small housings for a medical outfit up in Austin called Delphi Health. It is loud, oily, honest work, and I am good at it. I can hold a tolerance of 2 ten-thousandths of an inch on a part the size of a lipstick, and I can tell you by the sound alone when an insert is about to give up. I mention this not to brag, but because it is the truest thing about me. I am a person who measures. I do not guess at things I can measure, and I do not trust a number I have not checked twice. And when my whole life started coming apart, it was that habit, more than any cleverness, that saved me. People who knew me only from the church parking lot or the checkout line at the H-E-B thought of me as the cheerful one. Opal, who always asks after your mama. Opal, who brings the good jalapeno cornbread to the potluck. They were not wrong. But cheerful is a thing you can do with your face, while something quieter and harder keeps working underneath. And mine kept working the whole time. My mother, Renata York, bought the house on Sabinal Street in 1994 with money she made cleaning vacation homes and doing books for a plumbing company. And she paid it off in 19 years, and she was prouder of that clean title than of anything else she ever did. It is not a grand house. It is 1,100 square feet, 2 bedrooms, a screened porch my father enclosed badly before he left, and a live oak in the front yard that is older than the town charter. When Mama died of pancreatic cancer in the fall of 2021, she left the house to me. Not to me and Kelly, to me. And that word alone is where you have to understand something about my family. Because Kelly is my half-sister, my father's daughter by a woman named Loretta from before he married my mother. And Kelly did not grow up in that house. She grew up in Bernie with Loretta, and she came into my life when I was 19 and she was 22, showing up at a community college financial aid office where I happened to be working the desk, both of us realizing halfway through the conversation that we had the same last name and the same crooked left eyebrow. I want to be fair about the good years, because there were good years, and I refuse to pretend there weren't. For a long time, I loved Kelly the uncomplicated way you love someone who arrives in your life like a gift you did not know to ask for. We were both girls raised a little bit sideways by a man who could not stay, and that gave us a shorthand. She taught me to drive a stick shift in the parking lot of the Bernie Middle School in her old Ford Ranger, laughing every time I killed the engine, patient in a way that surprised me. When my first serious boyfriend broke my heart at 22, she drove 90 minutes to sit on my floor and eat a whole box of those pink circus animal cookies with me, the frosted kind with the little white sprinkles. And she did not say one wise thing. She just stayed. When I married and then unmarried a decent, boring man named Randall in my late 20s, Kelly was the one who helped me move my boxes out. For 15 years, she was, plainly, the person I trusted most in the world after my mother. That is the part that mattered. That is the part that made the rest possible. Because you cannot be robbed by a stranger. Not really. Not in the way I was robbed. A stranger can only take your things. It takes someone you trusted to take your footing. The cooling did not come all at once, and I did not see it clearly until I lined it up afterward, the way I line up a set of parts and see the drift that no single measurement showed me. But there were 4 moments, and I can name all 4. The first was Dell. Kelly married Del Prater in the spring of 2019, a big man from up around Llano who sold agricultural insurance and had opinions about everything, and a way of restating whatever you had just said back to you, as though he had thought of it and improved it. From the beginning, something in me went quiet around him, the way I go quiet when a machine is running rough, and I cannot yet say why. He was never rude to me, not once, not in a way you could hold up to the light. But he had a habit of doing the family's math out loud at gatherings. Who had what, who was owed what, who had been lucky. And he did it with a smile. And Kelly, who used to have her own opinions, began finishing her sentences by glancing at him to see if she had gotten them right. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself for 2 years. The second moment was the reading of my mother's will. In November 2021, in the office of a lawyer named Hollis Vandergriff on Main Street in Kerrville, with the smell of his pipe tobacco in the carpet. When Mr. Vandergriff read the line about the house coming to me alone, I did not look at Kelly because I did not want to see anything on her face. But I heard Del exhale through his nose, one short, hard breath, and I heard him murmur something to Kelly that I did not catch. And afterward, in the parking lot, Kelly hugged me and said all the right things. And then Del said, arm around his wife, that of course we would find a fair way to handle the house, as family, in time. There was no we. There was no house to handle. It was mine. But he said it so warmly, and I was so raw with grief that I said nothing. And I have thought since that my silence in that parking lot was the first small crack he found to work a wedge into. The third moment came almost a year later, October 2022, at Kelly's own kitchen table in comfort over a coffee cake she had made from Loretta's recipe. She told me, not quite meeting my eye, that money was tight, that Dell's insurance renewals had come in soft 2 years running, and that they had borrowed against their truck and were behind on a card. I offered what I had, which was not much, about $2,000, and she took it, and she cried, and I felt useful. And then at the door, Dell appeared and said, and I remember the exact words because they sat wrong, "You know, Opal, that house of yours is a lot of house for one woman. Equity like that, just sitting there. Sinful, almost, in times like these." I laughed it off, but something in me filed it, the way I file a strange reading even when the part passes inspection, because a reading that strange means something is coming. The fourth moment I did not recognize as a moment at all until much later. In January 2023, Kelly asked me, casually, over the phone, whether Mama's old will had ever set up anything special about the house, any trust, any co-ownership, just so we understand where things stand as a family. I said no, that it was simply mine, and I did not think again about why she had asked. I know now she was checking the locks. I know now that Dell had sent her to check the locks. And here is the thing I have to say plainly, because the prompt of my own life kept asking it of me. Dell was the engine, but Kelly was the one at the door. She was not the strong one in that marriage, not by a mile. She was a follower who had been steered by a stronger will until she could not tell his wants from her own. That does not make her innocent. A follower who signs is still the one who signed. But it changes the shape of the anger, and mine took the shape not of hatred, but of a cold, exact grief. The grief you feel for someone who is drowning and slapping away the hand you put out. Now the folder. Now the worst night. It was the last Friday in April 2023, and Kelly asked to come by the house on Sabinal Street. Alone, she said, just to talk, sisters. I made a pot of coffee in Mama's old percolator, the one that ticks like a clock while it heats, and I set out the good cups, and I was glad, God help me, I was glad she wanted to come. She sat at the kitchen table where we had eaten 1,000 meals, and she put a manila folder on the wood between us, and she could not look at me, and she told me what had been done. 6 weeks earlier, she said, a mortgage of $210,000 had been taken out against the house on Sabinal Street. My house. The house with my name alone on the title. It had been arranged through a small lender out of San Antonio, using a set of documents that bore what looked like my signature and a notarization I had never sat for. Kelly's name and Dell's name were on the application as guarantors and as the parties who received the funds, which had already been dispersed and already been spent, most of it on Dell's insurance debts and on a note against a piece of ranch land near Llano that Dell had bought at the top of the market and could not carry. The house I had grown up in, the house my mother paid off with 19 years of other people's dust in her lungs, had been quietly turned into collateral for my half-sister's husband's bad bets, and I had not signed a single true page of it. I did not raise my voice. I want to be honest about the shape of the next few seconds, because I have heard people describe rage as heat, and I did not feel heat. I felt the opposite. I felt everything in me drop about 10 degrees and go very quiet and very clear. The way the shop goes when the compressor cuts out and suddenly you can hear the small sounds you had stopped hearing. I looked at the folder, and I looked at my sister's face, and I looked past her at Dell, who I only then realized had come after all and was standing by the pantry door with that patient, waiting look. And I understood that Kelly had not come to confess. She had come to close the sale. She had come to tell me it was already done, so that I would accept it as weather, as a thing that had happened, rather than a thing someone had chosen. And Dell had come to make sure she said it right. "Who notarized this?" I said. Not a shout, a question, the way I would ask which chuck was on a machine. Kelly's mouth trembled. Dell answered for her, smooth as insurance. "Everything was handled properly, Opal. There's no call to get lawyers into a family matter. What's done is done. We'll all be better for it once Dell's land turns around." And Kelly nodded at his voice like a woman keeping time. I told them to leave my mother's house. Kelly cried at the door, and Dell put his hand on the small of her back and steered her out to the truck. And I stood on the enclosed porch my father built badly and watched their taillights go down Sabinal Street. And that is the image I keep returning to, the manila folder still sitting on the table behind me, holding what they thought was the end of the story, and the percolator still ticking, long after there was any reason to. The turn was not a decision I made, so much as a decision that made itself in me overnight. I did not sleep. I sat at the table until the sky over the live oak went from black to the color of a nickel. And somewhere in those hours, the grief finished changing into something with edges. I understood 3 things by dawn. First, that a signature I never made is not a signature, and that a notarization of a person who was never present is a lie with a legal name. Second, that the same habit that let me hold 2 ten-thousandths of an inch would let me take this apart, patiently, part by part, without ever once raising my hand or my voice. And third, the thing that changed everything, the thing Dell in all his out-loud math had never once bothered to measure. He thought the house was the only thing I owned that mattered. He had never asked what else my mother left me, because a house you can see, and a house has equity you can borrow against, and Dell only counted what he could put a lien on. Here is the thing I owned that Dell never counted, and I am going to say it as plainly as I can because it is the whole hinge of this. Back in 2015, 6 years before she died, my mother had put most of her savings into a small local outfit, a member-owned housing cooperative called the Savinal Street Homes Cooperative, which owned and managed 4 little rental fourplexes in Kerrville that Mama had helped set up with a handful of other working women as a way to keep decent rentals in town out of the hands of the big Austin buyers. It was not glamorous. It threw off a small check twice a year. But when Mama died, her shares came to me along with the house. And because she had bought in early and bought in big, and because 2 of the founding members had since sold their stakes back to the cooperative, I was, without ever having thought much about it, the majority shareholder. I held 58% of the membership shares, which meant that I, and I alone, had the standing to call a special meeting of the cooperative's board under its bylaws and to bind it with a vote. That last fact would have meant nothing to this story except for one small, buried detail that I did not learn until I started reading every document my mother had ever signed, spread out across that same kitchen table over the next several weeks. The San Antonio lender that Dell and Kelly had used to remortgage my house was not, as they believed, a freestanding company. It was a lending arm that had been acquired 18 months earlier by a larger holding group, and that holding group had, as one of its small regional partners for co-op and workforce housing loans, a relationship with the very cooperative my mother had helped found. It was a tangle, and it took me and one other person weeks to be sure of it. But when we were sure, it came down to something a listener can hold in one hand: the sale and clean transfer of the lien on my house. The thing Dell needed to finish turning my equity into his cash required a sign-off that had to pass across the desk of a board on which my cooperative held a partner's approval seat. And the person who controlled my cooperative's vote on that seat was me. The other person was Courtney Alcaraz. I need to tell you about Courtney because allies in stories are too often just a pair of useful hands, and Courtney was a whole person with a life of her own. She was a real estate attorney in Kerrville, 41 years old, a widow who kept honeybees on a half-acre off Loop 534 and gave me a jar of the spring harvest every year that tasted faintly of the mountain laurel that grows all over the hill country. I had done a machining favor for her father before he passed, milled a bracket to fix an antique clock nobody else would touch, and she never forgot it. When I brought her the manila folder, she read it twice with her reading glasses down her nose, and then she took them off and said, "Opal, this isn't a family dispute. This is forgery, and it is loan fraud, and the first thing we are not going to do is let them see us hurry." That became the whole spirit of it. We did not hurry. From the first week of May through the first week of July, we built the thing quietly, the way I would build a fixture before a hard job, checking every clamp before I ran the tool. Courtney pulled the recorded mortgage from the Kerrville County records, and we got a certified copy of the forged deed of trust. And I sat with a document examiner she knew in San Antonio, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Nair, who had spent 19 years doing this. And Priya laid my true signature beside the forged one under a loop and showed me the 6 places the hand that made it had hesitated, had lifted, had never once in its life signed my name before. We tracked the notary, a man whose commission we found had lapsed and been quietly renewed with irregularities. And we found that on the date he swore I had appeared before him in Bexar County, I had, in fact, clocked in at Kerrville Precision at 6:52 in the morning and clocked out at 3:14 in the afternoon, a fact recorded in a payroll system that does not lie and does not love anybody. I pulled that time card myself. It felt like holding a hand grenade that happened to be shaped like a piece of paper. And Courtney found the seam in the cooperative structure, the one I have already told you about, the approval seat, and she walked me through my own bylaws, line by line, at her kitchen table with a jar of that mountain laurel honey open between us, until I understood exactly what I could do and exactly when it would have the most weight. Because timing was the last piece, and timing is a thing a machinist respects. Dell's whole plan depended on the lien being sold clean to a servicer up the chain so the cash could be finalized and the paper trail could go cold. And that clean sale was scheduled to close in the second week of July. If I called my special meeting and cast the cooperative's vote against approving that transfer, the sale did not slow down, it stopped. And every dollar Dell thought was already his went back to being a $210,000 hole with his name and Kelly's at the bottom of it, and a forgery at its root. Courtney and I set the meeting, and we set it deliberately for the second Saturday of July, one day before the sale was to close. That second Saturday was the day of the big York family dinner, held every summer at my Aunt Delphine's place outside Comfort. 40 acres of cedar and one long screened room built onto the side of a barn, with folding tables and my aunt's tamales and 30-some relatives who only see each other once a year. Dell loved that dinner. He loved a big table and an audience for his out-loud math. Kelly and Dell would be there, seated near the head as they liked to be. I told no one what I was carrying. I helped set the tables. I complimented my aunt's tamales, which deserved it. I let Dell hold forth about the land near Llano and how it was about to turn, how a data center outfit was sniffing around, how everybody who had doubted him would see. I let him say, at one point, glancing at me across the potato salad with that warm blade of a smile, that some folks just sit on what they've got and let it rot. No vision. And that a house is only a house until somebody with vision makes it work. The insult from the folder, dressed in Sunday clothes. I smiled and passed him the cornbread. And then, when the tamales were down to husks and my Uncle Ray was about to start the toast he starts every year, I stood up and I said I had one small piece of family business, and it would only take a minute. I have thought a great deal about that minute, and I did not do the thing you might expect. I did not shout, and I did not weep, and I did not fling any accusation across my aunt's tables. I set down a slim folder of my own, and I opened it, and I said in the plainest voice I had that 6 weeks earlier, a loan of $210,000 had been taken out against my house on Sabinal Street, the house my mother left to me alone, using a signature I had never made and a notary before whom I had never stood, and that I had proof of all of it. And then I said the second thing, the thing that turned the whole table cold, in the good way, the exact way I had planned. I said that the transfer of that loan up the chain, the sale that was to close the next morning and make all of it final, required the approval of a board on which our own family's cooperative, the one Mama founded, held a vote, and that I was the majority shareholder of that cooperative. And that 1 hour before I stood up, at the folding table with the tamales, using the wireless on my phone, I and the cooperative's board had held the special meeting I had lawfully called, and we had cast our vote, and I laid the signed and certified resolution on the table where the potato salad had been. We denied the sale. The lien could not transfer. It would sit, unsellable, on Dell and Kelly's names over a forgery come Monday morning, with a document examiner's report and a payroll time card and a lapsed notary commission all sitting under it like rebar in a slab. I watched Dell across the length of that table, and I will tell you what he did, because he did not do the thing weak men do in stories. He did not go white, and he did not stammer, and he did not beg. Del Prater smiled wider, and he spread his hands, and he started to talk, smooth and warm, about how this was a misunderstanding, a family matter, how lawyers only made things worse, how it would all come right when the land turned. He talked because talking was the only tool he had ever needed. But this time, the table was not with him. My Aunt Delphine set down the pitcher she was holding and looked at him the way you look at a wasp on a screen door. My Uncle Ray, who had known my mother 60 years, said, quiet, "Del, hush." And into the first silence I ever saw Del Prater fail to fill, Kelly made a sound I had never heard from her, a small, broken intake of breath, and she put both hands flat on the table as though the floor had tilted, and she looked at me, and then she looked at her husband, and I watched something come apart behind her eyes that had been holding her upright for 4 years. She did not defend him. That was the moment I had not been able to predict, and it is the moment I keep. She did not defend him. She put her face in her hands, and through her fingers she said, to me, not to him, "I told you it would be a minute. I didn't know it was..." And then she could not finish, and Dell said her name once, sharp, a leash snap, and for the first time in 4 years, she did not turn her head toward his voice. I did not gloat. There was nothing in me that wanted to. I gathered my slim folder and I said the last thing I had planned to say, and it was for Kelly, though the whole table heard it. I said that my mother had trusted her and had led her into a family she was born just outside of, and had believed to the end that blood you choose is blood, and that I had believed it too, and that the cruelest thing about all of this was not the $210,000. It was that I could have measured the house down to the square foot and never once thought I needed to measure my own sister. And then I went and helped my aunt with the dishes, because someone had to, and because my hands needed to be doing a thing that comes out right when you do it right. That is how I got to the peach on the windowsill, and to the mockingbird, and to the strange gift of not being in a hurry. The harvest of it came in slow, over the months after, exactly as Courtney had told me it would. This was not the kind of win that finishes in a single Saturday. The lien sat unsellable and radioactive, and by September, the San Antonio lender, once it saw Priya Nair's report and understood the word forgery was going to be in every filing, was more frightened of me than I ever was of them, and they moved fast and quiet to unwind the whole loan and lift the encumbrance from my house, rather than be named in a fraud they had let through their own sloppy notary. My mother's title came clean again in October. My name alone, the way she left it. I never had to take Kelly to court, and I chose not to press the criminal side against her, though Courtney told me plainly I could have, because I did not want my Aunt Delphine's grandchildren growing up hearing that story at that table. Dell was another matter, and the lender's own referral to the district attorney about the notary and the false instruments is a slow harvest, still ripening as I tell you this. And I am content to let it ripen on its own schedule. The seed is in the ground. What grows from it is no longer my labor. Kelly and Dell are done. She filed in November, and it was not a fight, because there was nothing left to fight over but debt. And Dell went back up toward Llano to sit on his land that had not turned and was not going to. And Kelly moved into a small apartment in Bernie near her mother, Loretta, and got a job doing the books for a landscaping company, which is a thing she is good at and had forgotten she was good at while she spent 4 years being good at agreeing with a man. I will not pretend we are what we were. Some things you cannot unsign. But last month she left a jar of Loretta's fig preserves on my porch in Fredericksburg with a note that said only, "You were right to measure everything, and I'm sorry I made you learn to." And I have not thrown the note away, and I do not know yet what that means, and I am letting it ripen too. So here is where I actually am, now that you understand the peach. I still run the Mazak on the day shift at Kerrville Precision, and I still hold 2 10,000ths on a good day, and I still bring the jalapeno cornbread to the potluck. The house on Sabinal Street is mine, clean and clear, and I do not live in it because it holds too much of my mother to sleep in yet. So I rent it, cheap, to a young couple who both teach at the middle school and cannot afford the Austin prices that are creeping west toward us, which is exactly what Mama built the cooperative to hold back, and I like to think she would find that fitting. With the first year's rent and with the twice-a-year check from the cooperative that Dell never once thought to count, I did one thing that was purely for myself. I bought 30 peach trees, bare root, from an old orchard man out toward Stonewall, and I planted them on a leased acre behind my rent house. And this past week, the first of them came ripe. 3 years earlier than a peach tree has any business bearing, because the man swore they were a variety bred for a fast start, and I chose to believe him. Last Saturday, I invited Courtney and Priya and my Aunt Delphine and the young teachers from Sabinal Street out to the leased acre, and I set a folding table under the trees, and we ate the first peaches over a cutting board so the juice would not go to waste. And I poured everyone a small glass of a sparkling wine from a winery just up the road, and I made a toast. And it was not to revenge, and it was not to me. I raised the glass to Renata York, who cleaned other people's houses for 19 years to own one clean, and who bought early into a small, unglamorous thing that ended up being the quiet key to everything, and who taught me, without either of us knowing it was a lesson, that the most important measurements are the ones nobody thinks to take. Then I sent every one of them home with a paper sack of peaches, and I kept only enough for the windowsill, and I stood at my sink the next morning, eating one, in no hurry at all, listening to that mockingbird run through every song it has ever stolen. And I thought, that is the difference between Del and me in the end. He counted only what he could put a lien on. I planted something that would bear.